I didn't think you'd actually come, my daughter-in-law whispered when she opened the door, and somehow those 7 quiet words hurt more than being screamed it ever could. I stood there on Vanessa's front porch holding the pecan pie I'd spent all morning baking, still warm beneath the checkered kitchen towel wrapped around the dish. The November wind cut through my wool coat as laughter drifted from inside the house behind her. Warm light spilled across the hardwood floor. I could smell roasted turkey, cinnamon candles, and the expensive vanilla perfume Vanessa always wore when guests were coming over. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood her. Maybe she was joking. But then her smile tightened just slightly, the kind of smile people use when they're trying to stay polite while wishing you'd disappear. Traffic wasn't too bad, I said softly, pretending not to notice the awkwardness in her voice. I made Daniel's favorite pie. Vanessa glanced down at the dish like it was an inconvenience. Oh, right. Well, come in. I stepped inside slowly, brushing cold air from my coat sleeves. The house looked beautiful. Candles flickered across the dining room. Gold decorations lined the staircase banister. A long farmhouse table stretched across the room with elegant place settings and folded cream-colored napkins tied with tiny velvet ribbons. There were 8 chairs around the table. 8. I counted twice. My chest tightened before my mind fully caught up. Daniel appeared from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine. "Mom," he said quickly, surprised enough that he nearly stopped walking. "You made it. Made it." As if I were some distant relative who happened to stop by unexpectedly instead of the woman who spent 30 years raising him alone after his father worked double shifts at the steel plant outside Hartford. I smiled anyway. Of course I did. It's Thanksgiving. His eyes shifted toward Vanessa for half a second before he forced a nod. Right? Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving. Behind him, guests chatted comfortably in the living room. Vanessa's sister was curled up on the sofa laughing at something on her phone while 2 of Daniel's co-workers carried drinks. Toward the patio doors, my 11-year-old granddaughter Sophie ran past me holding a plate of cookies. She stopped when she saw me. "Grandma Helen," she said brightly, but Vanessa interrupted before the child could hug me. "Sweetheart, take those outside before they get cold." Sophie obeyed immediately. I watched her disappear through the hallway. Children notice tension faster than adults realize. "We had to rearrange seating a little," Vanessa said casually as she adjusted one of the napkins. "I hope you don't mind sitting over there." She pointed toward a small breakfast table beside the kitchen island. 1 chair, 1 plate, 1 glass, set apart from everyone else. Not at the family table, not beside my son, not even beside my granddaughter. Just close enough to hear everyone else laughing together. My fingers tightened around the pie dish. "Oh," I said quietly. "I see. It's just easier this way," Vanessa replied. "You know how crowded holidays can get." Daniel said nothing. That was the part one would remember later. Not Vanessa's coldness. Not the separate table. Not even the embarrassment burning behind my ribs while strangers pretended not to notice. It was my son standing there in silence while his mother was quietly removed from her own family. I placed the pie carefully on the counter and took off my coat. That was when I noticed the photographs hanging above the fireplace. New family portraits. Professional ones. Daniel in a navy sweater. Vanessa smiling beside him. Sophie between them. Even their golden retriever had made it into the pictures. But me? I was gone. Every older family photograph that once included me had disappeared from the wall completely. It felt strange how something so small could make a room suddenly feel ice cold. Vanessa followed my eyes and gave a soft laugh. "Oh, we finally updated the family wall," she said. "The old photos just didn't really match the house anymore." I nodded slowly. Then I smiled. Because in that moment, standing there beneath the warm lights of the house I once helped pay for, I realized something important. Vanessa wasn't trying to hurt me by accident. She was trying to erase me quietly. And somehow, that hurt even more. I sat at that little breakfast table beside the kitchen while the rest of my family laughed 10 feet away from me. Close enough to hear every joke. Far enough to understand exactly where I belonged now. Vanessa moved around the dining room with effortless confidence, refilling wine glasses and adjusting serving dishes like the queen of a kingdom she had carefully built for herself. Every time someone complimented the house, she smiled proudly and said things like, "We worked so hard making this place feel like home." I noticed she never once mentioned that Daniel and I had spent almost 2 years renovating that house together after his father passed away. I paid for the kitchen cabinets myself. I remembered standing beside contractors in 90-degree summer heat while Daniel worked long shifts downtown. Back then, Vanessa used to call me constantly for advice. What curtains matched the dining room? Which contractor could be trusted? What kind of hardwood floors increased resale value? Funny how people stop needing your wisdom once they finish using your resources. Sophie carried mashed potatoes toward the dining room table and paused beside me. "Grandma, why are you sitting here?" she asked innocently. Before I could answer, Vanessa's voice floated across the room. "Because Grandma Helen likes quieter spaces, sweetheart." Sophie frowned slightly. "But she always sits with us." Vanessa smiled without looking at me. "Things change sometimes." That sentence settled into my chest heavier than it should have. Things change sometimes. Over the past 3 years, I had heard different versions of those words again and again. Last Christmas, Vanessa decided they needed a smaller holiday this year. 2 months later, I saw photographs online of a 20-person Christmas dinner at their house. The year before that, Daniel forgot to tell me Sophie's piano recital had been moved to another date. I arrived carrying flowers and sat alone in an empty school auditorium while janitors folded metal chairs nearby. There was always an explanation, always a misunderstanding, always some soft, polite excuse that made me feel foolish for noticing patterns at all. I used to convince myself I was imagining it. Age does strange things to confidence. Once you pass 65, people start treating your instincts like confusion. Your memories become misunderstandings. Your loneliness becomes oversensitivity. I stopped speaking up because every conversation left me feeling embarrassed for needing reassurance in the first place. During dinner, Daniel barely looked at me. He laughed louder around Vanessa now, like a man constantly trying to prove he belonged in his own home. At one point, one of his co-workers asked how long his parents had been married before his father passed away. Daniel hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Vanessa answered for him. "Arthur died about 6 years ago," she said quickly. "Helen has been living alone ever since." Living alone. Such a simple phrase. But something about the way she said it made me sound temporary. Fragile. Like an elderly neighbor people politely checked on during snowstorms. Not the woman who built the Whitmore family from scratch while clipping grocery coupons at the kitchen table and stretching every paycheck until it nearly tore apart. After dessert, everyone gathered in the living room near the fireplace. I stayed behind collecting plates mostly because no one asked me to join them. As I carried dishes toward the sink, I noticed a framed photo sitting on the far counter near the coffee machine. It was newer than the others. Vanessa and Daniel stood smiling beside Sophie on a beach in Cape Cod. Across the bottom of the frame, written in elegant silver lettering, were the words, "The family that matters most." I stared at that sentence for a long moment while warm water ran across my hands. Then I quietly dried the dishes one by one and realized something I had been avoiding for years. Vanessa had not pushed me out all at once. She had done it slowly, carefully, patiently, like someone removing old wallpaper from a house until no trace remained underneath. The drive home felt longer than usual that night. Rain tapped softly against my windshield while old jazz played low through the speakers, but I barely heard any of it. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel. The entire way back to my house in West Hartford. Every few minutes, I replayed tiny moments from dinner in my mind. Vanessa adjusting place cards before I arrived. Daniel avoiding eye contact. The photographs missing from the wall. None of it seemed accidental anymore. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light had already switched on automatically. Arthur installed that sensor years ago because he worried about me walking up icy steps alone during winter evenings. For a moment, I just sat there in the dark garage staring at the empty passenger seat beside me. I used to leave family dinners exhausted in the best way. Full stomach, warm heart, leftovers wrapped in foil on my lap. Tonight, I felt like I had attended an event where everyone else knew the rules except me. Inside the house, everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning. The knitted blanket folded neatly across the couch. The framed wedding photograph beside the fireplace. Arthur's reading glasses still resting near his favorite chair, even though he had been gone 6 years now. Some people said I should have packed his things away by now, but grief does not move according to schedules. Neither does love. I hung my coat carefully and carried the untouched pecan pie into the kitchen. No one had even cut a slice. I stood there looking at it for several seconds before finally placing it in the refrigerator beside last week's soup containers and a half-empty carton of milk. The silence inside the house felt unusually heavy. Not peaceful, not comforting, just heavy. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it upstairs to the small office Arthur used before he retired. Most nights I avoided that room because it still smelled faintly like cedar wood and old paper, but something pulled me there tonight. Maybe I needed to feel close to someone who once made me feel important. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet searching for old tax papers and accidentally found a thick cream-colored folder labeled Family Trust Documents. Arthur always handled financial paperwork himself. He used to joke that I would rather clean the gutters than sit through legal meetings. Normally I would have closed the folder immediately, but tonight was different. Tonight, I suddenly wanted to know exactly what remained of the life we built together. I carried the folder downstairs and spread the papers across the dining room table. Legal language blurred together at first. Trust agreements, property records, investment accounts. Most of it meant very little to me. Then one sentence caught my attention. Primary controlling beneficiary, Helen Whitmore. I blinked and read it again slowly. My name, not Daniel's. Mine. A strange feeling settled over me then. Not relief exactly. More like confusion mixed with unease. For the past few years, Vanessa had spoken constantly about their future assets and eventually consolidating family properties. I had assumed Daniel inherited everything automatically after Arthur passed away. But according to these documents, that was not true at all. Around midnight, my phone buzzed beside the papers. A text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. Hope you got home safe. Sorry if tonight felt crowded. Hosting gets stressful sometimes. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I noticed the second text arriving seconds later. Also, Daniel mentioned you still have copies of the old property paperwork. We should probably organize all that soon. My chest went cold. There it was. Not concern. Not apology. Paperwork. I slowly looked back down at the trust documents spread across my table while rain continued tapping against the windows outside. And for the first time in years, I stopped wondering whether Vanessa wanted me gone emotionally. Suddenly, I started wondering what she wanted financially. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that separate table beside the kitchen and the empty space on the family photo wall where my face used to be. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up pretending rest would come and walked downstairs in my robe to make coffee. The house creaked softly beneath my feet, familiar and steady in a way my life no longer felt. Outside, the first snow of the season had started falling across the neighborhood. Tiny white flakes drifted beneath the streetlights, covering lawns and parked cars in silence. Arthur loved the first snowfall. He used to wake Daniel when he was little and bundle him into oversized winter coats before taking him outside to build snow forts before sunrise. I stood at the kitchen window holding my coffee mug and suddenly realized something painful. Vanessa knew almost none of those stories. She knew the polished version of our family, the successful son, the comfortable retirement accounts, the renovated house, but she had no idea how hard we fought for any of it. Daniel had asthma as a child. I spent years sleeping lightly, listening for coughing through baby monitors while Arthur worked overtime at the mill. There were winters we could barely afford heating oil, summers when we canceled vacations because hospital bills came first. I sold my mother's wedding bracelet once just to cover Daniel's tuition payment during his sophomore year at Boston College. Not because I had to, because I wanted his future to feel bigger than mine ever did. And now somehow I had become the extra chair no one wanted at Thanksgiving dinner. Around 9 that morning, I called the law office listed on the trust documents. A receptionist transferred me to a man named Charles Bennett. The moment he heard my name, his tone softened immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said warmly. "I wondered when you might finally call." That sentence made me pause. "You knew about these documents?" I asked carefully. "Your husband reviewed them every year before he passed," Mr. Bennett replied. "Arthur was very clear about protecting you." Protecting me. The words settled heavily in my chest. We arranged to meet that afternoon at his office downtown. I almost canceled twice before leaving the house. Part of me still felt guilty for questioning my own son. Mothers are trained to protect their children even when it hurts us. Especially when it hurts us. Mr. Bennett's office overlooked Main Street, decorated with dark wooden shelves and old framed Yale diplomas. He looked to be in his late 70s now, silver-haired and calm in the way only experienced attorneys seem to become. After offering me tea, he opened a thick folder and adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, he began gently. Your husband anticipated certain risks after his death. I frowned slightly. Risks? Mr. Bennett nodded. Arthur worried that grief and financial pressure might make Daniel vulnerable to outside influence. Outside influence. Even hearing the phrase made my stomach tighten. He slid several papers toward me across the desk. The Whitmore Family Trust remains fully under your control while you are alive. The properties, investment accounts, and ownership shares tied to the family business cannot be transferred without your direct authorization. I stared down at the paperwork in stunned silence. Daniel does not own any of it. I asked quietly. Not outright, Mr. Bennett replied. He is a conditional beneficiary. I looked up sharply. Conditional? Mr. Bennett hesitated before speaking carefully. Arthur included a clause addressing elder manipulation and intentional family isolation. My fingers slowly tightened around the teacup in my hands. Suddenly the room felt colder despite the sunlight pouring through the windows. What exactly does that mean? I whispered. Mr. Bennett folded his hands together. It means if anyone attempts to isolate you emotionally or pressure you into surrendering family assets against your interests, Daniel could lose substantial inheritance rights. I sat perfectly still after that. Somewhere outside, car horns echoed faintly through downtown Hartford traffic. Inside the office, the silence stretched between us. Then Mr. Bennett looked directly at me and asked a question no one had asked in years. Mrs. Whitmore, he said softly, has someone been making you feel unwelcome in your own family? I could not answer Mr. Bennett right away. The question sat between us like something fragile and dangerous. Has someone been making you feel unwelcome in your own family? Most people imagine betrayal as one terrible moment. A screaming argument, a slammed door, cruel words spoken in anger. But what Vanessa had done felt different. Slower, cleaner somehow. Like watching someone slowly dim the lights in a room until one day you realize you have been sitting in darkness for years. I looked down at my hands, folded tightly in my lap. I think, I said quietly, I stopped feeling like Daniel's mother a long time ago. Mr. Bennett did not interrupt. He simply listened, which made the words come easier than I expected. I told him about the separate table at Thanksgiving, the missing photographs, the holidays I somehow always missed by accident, the constant feeling that I was slowly being repositioned from family member to occasional guest. When I finished speaking, the old attorney leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. Arthur was worried about this exact situation, he admitted softly. Hearing my husband's name nearly broke something inside me. Arthur had always noticed things before I did. He used to say kindness was both my greatest strength and my biggest blind spot. I remembered one evening years ago after Vanessa first started dating Daniel seriously. We had just returned from dinner, and Arthur stood quietly at the kitchen sink rinsing wine glasses while I talked about how polished and ambitious Vanessa seemed. Be careful with people who treat relationships like ladders, he said casually. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Now those words echoed in my mind with painful clarity. Before leaving the office, Mr. Bennett handed me copies of the trust documents inside a leather folder. You should keep these somewhere secure, he said. And Mrs. Whitmore, do not let anyone pressure you into signing anything quickly. Outside, downtown Hartford buzzed with early holiday shoppers carrying coffee cups and department store bags through the cold afternoon air. Life moved normally around me, while mine suddenly felt split into before and after. Before I understood what Vanessa was doing. After I finally saw it clearly. That evening Daniel called just as I was reheating leftover soup for dinner. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hey Mom, he said. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we should all sit down sometime this week and go over some family paperwork together. I stared silently at the steam rising from my soup bowl. There it was again. Paperwork. Not concern about my feelings after Thanksgiving. Not an apology for the separate table. Just paperwork. What kind of paperwork? I asked carefully. Nothing major, Daniel replied quickly. Just simplifying things long term. Vanessa thinks it would help everyone if assets were consolidated early. Consolidated. Such a clean little word for taking control of someone else's life. I closed my eyes briefly. I am not ready to discuss financial matters right now, I said calmly. Silence filled the line for half a second too long. Then Daniel laughed awkwardly. Sure. Of course. No pressure. But I heard it underneath his voice. Disappointment. Maybe even frustration. After we hung up, I carried my soup into the living room and sat beneath the old grandfather clock Arthur restored by hand 20 years ago. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the quiet house while snow continued falling softly outside the windows. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to earn my place back in my family. Instead, I started asking a much more dangerous question. What would happen if I simply stopped giving them access to everything they had been quietly taking from me all along? The first thing I stopped paying for was Sophie's private school tuition. I did not make an announcement about it. I did not call anyone to argue or explain myself. I simply contacted the accounting office on Monday morning and informed them that beginning next semester, the Whitmore Educational Grant would be discontinued. The woman on the phone sounded surprised. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you certain?" she asked carefully. "You have funded this program for nearly 6 years." I looked out the kitchen window while snow melted slowly across my backyard fence. "Yes," I said calmly. "I am certain." Hanging up the phone felt strangely quiet. No dramatic music. No shaking hands. Just silence. For years I believed love meant making myself endlessly useful. Tuition payments. Vacation deposits. Emergency loans. Birthday checks slipped into greeting cards. Every financial gesture became another invisible thread tying me to people who no longer treated me like family unless they needed something. By Wednesday afternoon, Daniel called. "Mom," he said slowly. "Vanessa mentioned the school contacted us about tuition." I stirred tomato sauce on the stove without rushing to answer. "Yes," I replied. I decided to step back from certain expenses. Another silence. I noticed how quickly concern appeared once money disappeared. "Is everything okay financially?" he asked. The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it revealed everything. They never asked whether I was lonely. Never asked whether I felt forgotten. But financial changes? Those received immediate attention. "Everything is perfectly fine," I answered. "I simply think some responsibilities belong to parents." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Mom, Sophie loves that school." "Then I am sure the two of you will find a way to continue supporting her education," I said softly. He sounded frustrated after that, though he tried hiding it beneath politeness. "Vanessa is going to be stressed hearing this." There it was again. Vanessa. Every conversation eventually circled back to Vanessa's comfort. Vanessa's plans. Vanessa's expectations. I ended the call kindly, but when I hung up, I realized something important. For the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. Thursday evening, Vanessa sent me a long text message filled with cheerful concern. She asked whether I was feeling overwhelmed lately, whether grief was making financial management difficult, whether perhaps Daniel should start helping oversee my accounts to reduce stress. I read the message twice while sitting in Arthur's old leather chair. The manipulation almost impressed me. Everything sounded caring on the surface. Beneath it sat the quiet assumption that age automatically meant weakness. I never responded. Instead, I spent the following week reviewing every account connected to the family trust. Mortgage assistance for Daniel's house. Annual vacation reimbursements. Maintenance payments tied to the lake property in Vermont. Small automatic transfers I had not questioned in years because I trusted family. Mr. Bennett helped me organize everything carefully. "You have been extraordinarily generous," he admitted one afternoon while reviewing spreadsheets inside his office. Generous. Maybe too generous. Arthur used to warn me that people become comfortable standing in rooms they never helped build. Friday night, Daniel and Vanessa hosted another dinner party. I knew because Sophie accidentally mentioned it during our phone call. "Mommy bought a new dress because Daddy's boss is coming over," she said excitedly. "Are you coming too?" I paused briefly. "No, sweetheart," I answered gently. "I do not think so." Sophie sounded disappointed. "But Grandma, you always come." Her innocent confusion hurt more than the exclusion itself. Children still remember the original version of love before adults teach them convenience. Later that evening, while washing dishes alone, I realized something had shifted permanently inside me. I no longer wanted invitations from people who needed my wallet more than my presence. And somewhere deep beneath the sadness, another feeling had quietly begun growing. Clarity. 2 weeks before Christmas, Vanessa invited me to brunch. That alone told me something was wrong. For years, invitations from her arrived only when there was an audience involved. Birthdays, holidays, business dinners where appearing close to family benefited her image. But brunch alone? That was new. I arrived at a small upscale cafe near West Hartford Center just after 10 in the morning. Vanessa was already seated near the window wearing a cream-colored coat and gold jewelry delicate enough to look effortless, but expensive enough to remind everyone she noticed status. She smiled brightly when I approached. Too brightly. "Helen," she said warmly, standing to hug me. "You look wonderful." I sat across from her slowly. "Thank you." The waitress poured coffee while Vanessa chatted about meaningless things for several minutes. Holiday decorations downtown. A charity auction. Sophie's upcoming choir concert. She spoke with the polished ease of someone carefully preparing a stage before introducing the real performance. Finally, she folded her hands neatly on the table and tilted her head with practiced concern. "I have been worried about you lately," she said softly. I stirred cream into my coffee without reacting. "That is kind of you." "Daniel worries too," she continued. "You have seemed distant these past few weeks." Distant. Interesting word choice. Not hurt. Not excluded. Distant. As though I had simply drifted away on my own. Vanessa leaned closer slightly. "We just want to make sure everything is manageable for you now that you are getting older." There it was. The sentence hidden beneath all the careful politeness. Older. Manageable. I suddenly understood the strategy perfectly. If they could frame me as fragile enough, dependent enough, uncertain enough, then eventually controlling the trust would appear responsible instead of greedy. I looked out the cafe window toward the snow piled along the sidewalks. "I manage quite well," I said calmly. Vanessa smiled patiently, the way adults smile at stubborn children. "Of course you do. But there are easier options now. Communities designed for seniors. Financial oversight programs. Downsizing before things become overwhelming." I slowly set my spoon beside the saucer. "Are you suggesting I cannot handle my own affairs?" "No," she replied quickly. "Not at all. I just think families should plan ahead." Families. Funny how that word appeared most often when money entered the conversation. The waitress arrived with our food then. Avocado toast for Vanessa. Vegetable omelet for me. Vanessa waited until the waitress walked away before continuing. "You know Daniel feels enormous pressure carrying everything financially." I nearly laughed out loud at that. Carrying everything financially. The mortgage assistance. Sophie's tuition. The Vermont property taxes. The annual trust distributions. I had quietly supported half their lifestyle for years while receiving less emotional warmth than their golden retriever. But I simply nodded thoughtfully. "I see." Vanessa relaxed slightly, probably mistaking my calmness for surrender. "Honestly, Helen," she said gently, "sometimes letting go gracefully preserves relationships." The sentence landed softly but carried sharp edges underneath. Let go gracefully. In other words, disappear quietly. Hand over control politely. Accept becoming irrelevant with dignity. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Arthur used to say something interesting," I said. Vanessa blinked. "What was that?" I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. "He said people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe someone else has become weak." For the first time all morning, Vanessa lost control of her expression. Only for a second, but I saw it. The flicker behind her eyes. Calculation interrupted by uncertainty. Then she smiled again, though this time it looked tighter around the edges. "I am sure Arthur meant well." "He usually did," I replied softly. After brunch, Vanessa hugged me goodbye in the parking lot beneath falling snowflakes. "We are only trying to help," she whispered. I smiled politely as she walked toward her luxury SUV. But while I stood there watching her drive away, I finally understood something with absolute clarity. Vanessa did not want reconciliation. She wanted compliance. And for the first time since Arthur died, I realized I no longer had any intention of giving it to her. 3 days before Christmas, Daniel called asking if I would host Christmas Eve dinner at my house like I always had. His voice sounded unusually careful, almost nervous beneath the surface politeness. I stood in the grocery store parking lot listening to him, while cold wind rattled shopping carts nearby. "Vanessa thinks it would mean a lot to everyone if we kept traditions alive," he said. Traditions. Another interesting word. Traditions mattered now because they needed something from me again. I looked across the gray December sky and thought about every Christmas I had spent making our home feel magical for other people. Arthur hanging lights across the porch roof while Daniel and I baked sugar cookies in the kitchen. Sophie falling asleep on the couch beneath piles of wrapping paper. Years of cooking, cleaning, decorating, hosting. building warmth for people who eventually made me feel cold inside my own family. All right, I answered calmly. You can all come at 6. Daniel sounded relieved immediately. Great. Mom, that means a lot. After we hung up, I sat inside my car for several minutes watching snow collect against the windshield. Something inside me felt strangely peaceful now. Not happy, just clear. Christmas Eve arrived bitterly cold. I spent the afternoon preparing dinner slowly, letting old jazz records play through the house while candles flickered in the windows. The dining table looked beautiful beneath soft golden light. But this year, I made one important change. I set exactly 4 chairs at the table instead of 5. One for Daniel, one for Vanessa, one for Sophie, one for me. No extra seating, no side tables, no quiet humiliation waiting beside the kitchen. At 6:05, the doorbell rang. Vanessa entered first carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing a smile polished enough for a magazine cover. Daniel followed behind her holding wrapped gifts while Sophie rushed forward to hug me tightly around the waist. Grandma, your house smells like Christmas, she whispered happily. I held her a little longer than usual. Thank you, sweetheart. During dinner, Vanessa acted almost painfully charming. She complimented the food repeatedly, asked thoughtful questions about old family recipes, even laughed at stories she normally ignored. Watching her work so hard to appear warm would have been impressive if it were not so transparent. Halfway through the meal, Daniel finally cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, he began carefully. Vanessa and I wanted to revisit the conversation about long-term planning. There it was, right on schedule. I placed my wine glass gently on the tablecloth. What kind of planning? Vanessa smiled softly. We just think it would ease your stress if Daniel started helping manage some of the properties and accounts. Sophie looked between us quietly while cutting ham into tiny pieces on her plate. Even children can feel tension adults pretend is invisible. Daniel leaned forward slightly. We are only trying to help, Mom. Help. Such a gentle word for what they were really asking. I folded my napkin carefully and stood from the table without rushing. There is actually something I would like to share with both of you tonight, I said calmly. Vanessa's smile brightened instantly, probably expecting surrender. I walked into Arthur's old office and returned carrying the leather folder Mr. Bennett had prepared for me earlier that week. Then I placed it quietly in front of Daniel. What is this? He asked. Your father's trust documents, I answered. The room suddenly became very still. Vanessa reached for the folder first, but Daniel opened it before she could. I watched confusion slowly spread across his face as he scanned the pages. Mom, he whispered finally, I do not understand. Yes, I replied softly. I think that is exactly the problem. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost immediately. Helen, maybe this is not the right time for legal discussions. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. Actually, I said calmly, I think it is the perfect time. Daniel kept turning pages long after the room had gone silent. I watched his expression shift slowly from confusion to disbelief while Christmas music played softly somewhere in the background near the fireplace. Sophie sat quietly beside me sipping hot chocolate, unaware that her parents' entire understanding of their future had just changed. Vanessa reached toward the folder again, but this time Daniel pulled it slightly closer to himself. Mom, he said carefully, this says the trust stays fully under your control. Yes, I replied calmly. It always has. Vanessa forced a small laugh that sounded thin around the edges. Well, of course it does right now. But eventually Daniel will oversee everything, correct? I looked at her steadily across the candlelight. Not automatically. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. Daniel continued reading while lines slowly formed across his forehead. Then he stopped suddenly at one particular paragraph. I saw the exact moment he found the clause Arthur had written years ago. What does this mean? He asked quietly. I folded my hands in my lap. Your father believed family loyalty mattered more than inheritance. Daniel swallowed hard while reading the legal wording again. Any evidence of elder manipulation, coercion, or intentional emotional isolation would immediately suspend beneficiary privileges tied to the Whitmore family trust. Vanessa's face lost color almost instantly. This is ridiculous, she said sharply. That language could mean anything. Arthur wanted it to mean something very specific, I answered softly. Daniel looked up at me slowly then. Really looked at me for the first time in years. Mom, he whispered, Why did you never tell me any of this? I almost smiled at the question because the answer felt painfully simple. Because I thought you loved me without needing legal documents involved. No one spoke after that. Outside, snow drifted quietly past the windows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily from the hallway. Finally, Vanessa stood abruptly from the table. I think this conversation has become unnecessarily dramatic, she said coldly. We have only ever tried to help you. I looked at her calmly. No, I replied. You tried to manage me. Her jaw tightened immediately. That is unfair. Is it? I asked gently. You removed my photographs from your walls. Seated me separately at Thanksgiving. Spoke about senior communities before ever asking whether I was lonely. Every conversation eventually led back to assets, properties, accounts, or control. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because some truths become impossible to decorate once they are spoken aloud. Daniel lowered the papers slowly onto the table. Vanessa, he said quietly, did you know about all the financial support Mom was still providing? She hesitated 1 second too long. That was enough. I watched something shift inside my son then. Not anger exactly. More like realization. The slow, painful understanding that someone he trusted had carefully shaped the way he saw his own mother. Sophie looked between all of us nervously. Are we still opening presents? She asked softly. The innocence in her voice nearly broke my heart. I reached over and squeezed her small hand gently. Of course we are, sweetheart. And we did. Because children should never carry the weight of adult greed. Later that night, after the gifts were opened and the dishes cleaned, Daniel lingered near the front door while Vanessa waited silently beside the car outside. Mom, he said quietly, unable to fully meet my eyes. I think I owe you an apology. I studied his face for a long moment. He looked older somehow, like someone waking up from a dream that suddenly no longer made sense. You owe yourself honesty first, I answered softly. He nodded once without speaking. Then he walked out into the falling snow. Months later, I removed Daniel's access to several trust accounts and redirected most future distributions into charitable foundations Arthur and I had quietly discussed years before. Scholarships, community housing, programs supporting widowed women rebuilding their lives after loss. Vanessa stopped calling completely after that. Daniel called more than he used to, though our conversations remained careful and unfinished for a long time. Healing moves slower than betrayal. But some evenings Sophie still visits my house after choir practice, curling beside me on the couch while snow falls quietly outside the windows. And every now and then, when the house grows still enough, I think back to that lonely little table beside the kitchen on Thanksgiving night. Vanessa thought she was slowly erasing me from the family I built. What she never understood was this. You cannot remove the foundation from a house and still expect the walls to stand.